Every village has its whispers, things said quietly and things never spoken at all. And every footstep leaves something behind. In places like this, silence is never empty. It listens, it remembers. Miss Marple knew one simple truth. People rarely hide their secrets, they hide them in plain sight. Tonight, listen closely, because the truth is already moving. A Christmas Mystery in St. Mary Mead. Chapter 1. Holly, Frost, and an Uneasy Silence. St. Mary Mead prepared for Christmas with a seriousness that bordered on competition. Each cottage seemed determined to outdo its neighbour in festive restraint. Never too much, never too little. Holly wreaths appeared on doors overnight, red berries bright against frost-whitened hedges, windows glowed with modest strings of lights, and the church bell practised carols at odd hours, as though even it were uncertain of the correct tune. Miss Marple observed all this from her front window, knitting needles clicking softly in her hands. She had lived long enough in St. Mary Mead to know that Christmas revealed people more clearly than any other season. Kindness became deliberate, cheerfulness rehearsed, and guilt, when it existed, often tried very hard to disguise itself beneath goodwill. She was working on a scarf for her nephew Raymond, counting stitches with practiced accuracy, when she noticed Leonard Pritchard crossing the green. Mr. Pritchard was a familiar figure in the village, owner of Pritchard's Drapery, chairman of the Christmas committee, and a man who always wore his respectability as carefully as his neatly pressed coats. This morning, however, he walked more briskly than usual, his head lowered, his scarf wrapped twice around his neck, as though he wished to disappear into it. Miss Marple paused her knitting. "Trouble," she murmured, not unkindly. She had seen the same posture in young men leaving the rectory after difficult conversations, and in women returning from the post office with letters they had hoped not to receive. Leonard Pritchard unlocked his shop door and went inside without once glancing around. A curious omission for a man who usually waved to passers-by. Miss Marple resumed knitting, though her attention had shifted elsewhere. The village hummed with preparation as the day progressed. Mrs. Havisham bustled past with parcels tucked under her arm, stopping twice to complain about the price of ribbon. Colin Reed, the young assistant from the drapery shop, hurried by with a stack of boxes, nearly dropping them when greeted. "Good morning, Miss Marple," he said, a little too quickly. "Good morning, dear," she replied. "You seem busy?" "Yes, very. Mr. Pritchard likes things just so before Christmas." "So he does," Miss Marple agreed. She noticed that Colin did not meet her eyes. That evening, just after dusk settled like a heavy curtain over the village, Miss Marple ventured out with a basket on her arm. The air smelled of frost and pine, and somewhere nearby a radio played a carol slightly out of tune. As she passed Pritchard's Drapery, she heard voices. Not cheerful ones. One voice, Leonard Pritchard's, was sharp, clipped and controlled. The other was lower, urgent, and carried the unmistakable tremor of someone pleading. "I can't continue like this," the second voice said. "You must," Pritchard replied. "You've no choice." Miss Marple slowed, not from curiosity, she disliked eavesdropping, but from instinct. She had heard similar words spoken many years ago between two sisters arguing over an inheritance. One of them had later sworn the other had never raised her voice. The shop door closed abruptly. Silence followed. Miss Marple continued on her way, but the words stayed with her. The discovery came the following afternoon. It was Mrs. Havisham who raised the alarm, her voice carrying across the green with remarkable strength for a woman who often claimed weak lungs. Pritchard's Drapery had not opened that morning. The door was locked, the lights were off, and Leonard Pritchard did not answer when called. The police arrived swiftly, along with a gathering of villagers who stood in clusters, whispering with the peculiar excitement that tragedy often brought. Miss Marple arrived later, quietly, and stood a little apart. Leonard Pritchard lay behind the counter, his body arranged almost neatly, one arm folded beneath him. His spectacles had been placed on the counter, lenses facing upward. A chair lay overturned nearby, as though pushed back in haste. Inspector Bell, newly assigned to the district, surveyed the scene with professional assurance. "Heart trouble, perhaps," he said. "No sign of struggle." Miss Marple said nothing. She noticed the half-finished cup of tea on the counter, the thin film of milk beginning to form on its surface. She noticed, too, that Mr. Pritchard's coat was buttoned carefully, despite the warmth of the shop. Most of all, she noticed the smell, faint, almost imperceptible, beneath the lavender polish. Almonds. The villagers reacted as villagers always do. Mrs. Havisham declared herself utterly shocked, though she had been heard complaining about Mr. Pritchard only the day before. Colin Reed looked pale and shaken, answering questions politely, but with a stiffness that suggested rehearsal. Emily Pritchard, Leonard's niece, arrived shortly after, her eyes red. Her expression composed in a way that struck Miss Marple as practiced rather than natural. "I was with friends last night," Emily said quietly. "I knew nothing until this morning." Miss Marple watched her gloved hands, folded neatly in her lap. People who were truly distraught, she had observed, rarely remembered their gloves. As the body was removed and the shop closed, snow began to fall, soft, steady, and generous. The village seemed to exhale, already reshaping the event into something easier to bear. "Terrible, just before Christmas," someone murmured. "Yes," Miss Marple agreed softly. "It often is." She walked home slowly, the snow crunching beneath her sensible shoes, her mind turning over small details the way one turned over pebbles at the edge of a stream. Arguments, gloves, almonds, and a man who liked everything just so. In her sitting room, she laid her knitting aside. Christmas, she reflected, was a season for goodwill. But it was also a season when secrets, long kept, sometimes decided they could wait no longer. And in St. Mary Mead, secrets were never patient for very long. Chapter 2. What the village remembered. St. Mary Mead had a way of rearranging events to suit itself. By the morning after Leonard Pritchard's death, the village had already decided on several things. That it was a terrible tragedy, that it was most unfortunate timing, and that there was very little else to be said. Curtains twitched with renewed energy, and the post office queue lingered longer than usual, people exchanging information with the gravity of diplomats. Miss Marple took her place in that queue, her hat properly pinned, her expression mildly concerned. She listened. "I always thought his heart wasn't strong," Mrs. Finch remarked, with the authority of someone who had once seen Mr. Pritchard sit down rather quickly. "Nonsense," said Mrs. Havisham briskly. "Leonard was as fit as any man his age. Never ill a day in his life while not properly ill." "Still," Mrs. Finch persisted, "Christmas can be a strain." Miss Marple smiled faintly. Christmas, she thought, strained people in very particular ways. When her turn came, she bought stamps she did not need and wished everyone a pleasant day. Outside, she paused, allowing the others to pass. Mrs. Havisham bustled by, her cheeks flushed, her voice already raised, in animated conversation with someone else. She had not, Miss Marple noticed, mentioned Leonard Pritchard by name once. Inspector Bell called later that afternoon. He was polite, respectful, and clearly determined to appear efficient. Miss Marple welcomed him with tea and a plate of ginger biscuits. "I understand you were in the village when the body was discovered, Miss Marple," he said. "Yes," she replied. I had just finished my shopping. And you noticed nothing unusual? Miss Marple considered this. Well, she said slowly, it depends what one means by unusual. Inspector Bell smiled indulgently. The argument, she continued gently, 2 nights before. His smile faded slightly. Ah, yes, we've heard about that. Business disagreement, apparently. Apparently, Miss Marple agreed, though people rarely raised their voices over invoices alone. Inspector Bell made a note, though not, Miss Marple observed, with any particular urgency. He thanked her, accepted another biscuit, and left. Miss Marple poured herself more tea and reflected that men often wrote things down to avoid thinking about them. Later that day, she visited the vicarage. Not officially, of course, just a friendly call. The vicar, a kind man with a habit of smoothing his hair when uneasy, spoke warmly of Leonard Pritchard's generosity. He was deeply involved in the Christmas fund, the vicar said, very committed. Was he distressed recently? Miss Marple asked. The vicar hesitated. Well, perhaps a little. He withdrew his donation last week. Said he'd overextended himself. Miss Marple nodded. Overextended, she thought, was a word people used when they did not wish to say trapped. From the vicarage, she went on to Pritchard's drapery, now shuttered and silent. Colin Reed stood nearby, rearranging a box of donated decorations for the church hall. He looked up sharply when he saw her. Oh, Miss Marple. Good afternoon, Colin, she said kindly. You must be having a difficult time. Yes, very difficult. Mr. Pritchard was, well, very particular. About many things. Yes, about everything. Miss Marple studied him. His hands moved constantly, straightening ribbons that were already straight. You worked late the night before his death? She asked. Yes, I left at 6, as usual. And Mr. Pritchard? He stayed behind. He often did. Did he drink tea in the evenings? Miss Marple asked. Colin frowned slightly. Tea? Yes, I suppose so. You suppose? Well, sometimes. Only when he was unsettled. Miss Marple thanked him and walked on, her thoughts neatly ordered. That evening, Emily Pritchard came to call. She arrived precisely at 6:30, dressed in dark, sensible clothing, her gloves immaculate. Her grief, like her appearance, was composed. I thought I should thank you, Emily said, for speaking kindly of my uncle. I only spoke honestly, Miss Marple replied. Sit down, dear. Emily perched on the edge of the chair, as though ready to leave at any moment. He was a good man, Emily said. Misunderstood at times. Many people are, Miss Marple agreed, especially by those closest to them. Emily's lips tightened briefly. He had worries, she said. But who doesn't? Indeed, Miss Marple said. Did he confide in you? No, he preferred to keep things to himself. Miss Marple glanced at Emily's gloves. You don't take them off? She asked lightly. Emily blinked. Oh, no! My hands are terribly cold these days. Miss Marple nodded. She had once known a woman who wore gloves indoors for an entirely different reason. As Emily left, snow began to fall again. Miss Marple watched it drift down, covering footprints, softening edges. The village would do the same, she knew, smooth over arguments, explain away silences, turn people into the versions they preferred to remember. But human nature, she reflected, was remarkably consistent. People who lied often spoke too smoothly, people who were frightened often spoke too much, and people who believed themselves clever frequently forgot the smallest, most inconvenient details. Miss Marple returned to her knitting, her needles clicking steadily. Leonard Pritchard had liked everything neat, but death, she thought, was rarely so accommodating. And Christmas had a way of bringing unfinished business into the open, whether one wished it or not. Chapter 3. The Quiet Things Left Behind. The first real frost came the morning after Emily Pritchard's visit, whitening the village green and giving St. Mary Mead an air of careful cleanliness. Miss Marple noticed, as she always did, how frost made everything look honest, while concealing very little underneath. After breakfast, she set out for a walk, her sensible boots crunching softly along the path. She had found that people were most inclined to remember things while walking, particularly when they believed they were merely passing the time. Her first stop was the church hall, where preparations for the Christmas fete continued despite recent events. Mrs. Havisham was in charge, directing volunteers with the authority of a general. "It's what Leonard would have wanted," she announced loudly, rearranging a table already well placed. He hated disorder. "So I understand," Miss Marple said pleasantly. Mrs. Havisham lowered her voice. "Of course he could be difficult, especially with money." "Could he?" Miss Marple asked. "Oh yes, very particular about who owed him and why. Not at all generous when it came to private matters." Miss Marple thought of the vicar's withdrawn donation and nodded. "He kept records, you know," Mrs. Havisham continued. "Little notes. He trusted paper more than people." "That's often unwise," Miss Marple said gently. Mrs. Havisham sniffed. "Still, it's all rather irrelevant now." Miss Marple smiled faintly. It was rarely irrelevant. Later that afternoon, she received an unexpected visitor. Colonel Bantry, red-faced from the cold and full of confident opinion, called in with his wife for tea. He had known Leonard Pritchard in a friendly, if superficial way. "Never liked the fellow much," he declared cheerfully. "Too neat. Men like that always have something to hide." Miss Marple glanced at Mrs. Bantry, who raised her eyebrows slightly. "Leonard once stayed for dinner," Mrs. Bantry said thoughtfully. "He barely touched the pudding." "Didn't care for sweets?" Miss Marple asked. "Oh no, he liked them well enough, but only under certain circumstances. He said sugar unsettled him." Miss Marple poured more tea. "Did he add sugar to his tea?" she asked casually. "Only when he was upset," Mrs. Bantry replied. "He said it helped him think." Miss Marple thanked them for coming and watched them leave, her mind quietly aligning itself. That evening, Inspector Bell returned, this time with a notebook and a faint air of irritation. "We can't find Leonard Pritchard's personal ledger," he said. "There should be one. Everyone agrees he kept meticulous records." "Everyone except the ledger," Miss Marple said mildly. Inspector Bell sighed. "You don't think it's significant?" "I think," Miss Marple replied, "that people remove things for reasons, sometimes to hide guilt, sometimes to delay consequences." Inspector Bell frowned. "Delay what exactly?" Miss Marple smiled. "Christmas, for one." The missing ledger became the village's favourite topic by the next morning. It was discussed in whispers, in speculation, and in firm conclusions reached without evidence. Colin Reed was seen pacing near the shop. Emily Pritchard was heard asking discreet questions at the post office. Mrs. Havisham told 3 different people she had always suspected something. Miss Marple watched, listened, and said very little. That afternoon she was invited to Emily Pritchard's cottage, a neat, modern little place at the edge of the village. Emily served tea with careful precision, placing each cup exactly the same distance from the saucer's edge. "I thought you might help me understand something," Emily said. "The village seems so eager to speculate." "They usually are," Miss Marple replied. "Speculation gives one a sense of involvement." Emily hesitated. "My uncle was not a bad man," she said, "but he had arrangements." "Arrangements are often misunderstood," Miss Marple agreed. Emily's gaze flicked briefly to the window. "He kept people under pressure," she continued. "It wasn't cruelty, it was control." Miss Marple nodded. "And pressure?" she said gently, has a way of building up. Emily smiled tightly. You make it sound so dramatic. Human nature usually is, Miss Marple replied. As Miss Marple walked home, she passed Pritchard's drapery once more. The snow had melted enough to reveal footprints, old ones, trampled and indistinct, but still there if one knew how to look. She paused, studying them. One set came and went with regularity. Another lingered. That evening, she wrote a short letter to her nephew Raymond, asking about a legal term she could not quite recall. She had found that correspondence often clarified thoughts better than silence. Before bed, she reviewed the facts as she understood them. Leonard Pritchard drank sugared tea only when distressed. He kept records that frightened people. Someone removed those records, not to destroy them, but to manage what would happen next, and everyone, she reflected, was behaving exactly as they always did when afraid. Miss Marple blew out her lamp and lay awake for a moment, listening to the quiet village sounds. Christmas was coming, and with it, she suspected, a moment when someone would panic and reveal far more than they intended. Chapter 4. When Pressure Slips Its Mask. By the fourth day, after Leonard Pritchard's death, St. Mary Mead had reached the stage Miss Marple privately described as decidedly uncomfortable. The village was no longer content with sympathetic murmurs and lowered voices. Opinions had begun to settle, firmly, confidently, and with very little evidence to support them. Snow lingered in thin, stubborn patches along the hedgerows, grey now rather than white, as though even the weather had grown tired of pretending innocence. Miss Marple noticed the change immediately. At the butcher's, conversation stopped when Colin Reid entered. At the post office, Emily Pritchard found herself served with a politeness that had acquired a brittle edge. Mrs. Havisham, meanwhile, appeared everywhere at once, dispensing certainty like advice. "It's always someone close," she announced to a captive audience in the queue. "That's what these things come down to." Miss Marple, standing behind her, said mildly, "Not always." Mrs. Havisham turned. "Well, almost always." Miss Marple smiled and said no more. People who spoke in absolutes rarely welcomed exceptions. That afternoon, Inspector Bell called again, this time with a less relaxed manner. "We've had a development," he said, settling himself into Miss Marple's armchair without being asked. "The doctor has confirmed that Leonard Pritchard was poisoned." Miss Marple inclined her head. "I thought as much." Inspector Bell eyed her. "You did?" "Yes. People don't arrange their spectacles so carefully in moments of collapse." He cleared his throat. The poison was slow-acting, added to something consumed regularly. "Sugar," Miss Marple said quietly. Inspector Bell stared at her. "I wondered when you'd get there," he said. Miss Marple poured tea. "I expect many people will arrive there eventually. The question is who knew when to use it." Inspector Bell hesitated. "We're focusing on those under financial pressure." "Pressure," Miss Marple repeated thoughtfully, "has a way of producing very different reactions." The effect of the announcement was immediate. Colin Reid was questioned again. His answers, though polite, grew defensive. He insisted he had no access to poison and no reason to harm his employer. "I owed him nothing," he said sharply. "He owed me promises." Emily Pritchard was less forthcoming. She appeared composed, but Miss Marple noticed that she had stopped wearing her gloves indoors. Instead, her hands were kept clasped tightly together. Mrs. Havisham, on the other hand, seemed invigorated by the turn of events. "Poison!" she exclaimed to anyone who would listen. "I always said there was something unnatural about the whole thing." Miss Marple reflected that Mrs. Havisham had said no such thing until that moment. That evening, a small incident occurred. Small, at least, to anyone who did not know how to look. Miss Marple was passing the church hall when she heard raised voices from inside. The door was ajar. She paused, knitting bag in hand. "I told you to leave it alone," Colin Reed hissed. "You don't understand," Emily Pritchard replied. "If they find it—" Miss Marple stepped deliberately on a loose stone. The voices stopped at once. Emily emerged moments later, pale but composed. Colin followed, his expression strained. "Oh, Miss Marple," Emily said. "We were just discussing arrangements for the fete." "Of course," Miss Marple replied. "These things can be terribly complicated." She watched them walk away in opposite directions. Pressure, she thought again, and cracks beginning to show. The real disturbance came the following morning. Colin Reed was found collapsed in his lodgings, unconscious, but alive. The doctor, summoned in haste, declared it a faint brought on by shock and exhaustion, but there was more. On the small table beside Colin's bed lay a notebook, thin, brown and well-worn, Leonard Pritchard's missing ledger. Inspector Bell arrived swiftly, his expression darkening as he examined it. "This changes things," he said. "Yes," Miss Marple agreed, though perhaps not in the way one might expect. The ledger revealed names, dates and amounts, small payments, carefully recorded. Blackmail, perhaps, or debts enforced with quiet persistence. Colin regained consciousness later that day, confused and frightened. "I didn't steal it," he insisted. "I found it. I was going to bring it to the police, but you waited," Inspector Bell said. Colin looked down. "I was afraid," Miss Marple nodded. Fear, she knew, often looked very like guilt. The village reacted swiftly and badly. Colin was pitied, suspected, defended and condemned, sometimes within the same conversation. Emily Pritchard withdrew almost entirely. Mrs. Havisham declared the mystery all but solved. Miss Marple remained calm. That evening, she visited Colin briefly, bringing soup and gentle conversation. "You did not poison Mr. Pritchard?" she said quietly. Colin stared at her. "How do you know?" "Because you panic openly," Miss Marple replied. "Clever criminals rarely do." He laughed weakly. Before leaving, Miss Marple glanced once more at the ledger. One page, she noticed, had been torn out very neatly. Someone, she reflected, had wanted part of the truth revealed and part concealed. As night fell over St. Mary Mead, Christmas lights flickered uncertainly in the cold air. Miss Marple sat by her fire, knitting once more, her thoughts ordered and patient. Someone was losing control. And when control slipped, human nature had a habit of speaking far louder than intention. Christmas was only days away. And so she suspected was the moment when the truth would begin to push back. Chapter 5. The village chooses its villain. St. Mary Mead, having once tasted suspicion, now consumed it with enthusiasm. By the next morning, the village had reached what Miss Marple privately thought of as the dangerous stage, the moment when people preferred an answer, any answer, to the discomfort of uncertainty. The ledger, Colin Reed's collapse, and Inspector Bell's tightened manner had combined to produce something close to collective relief. "At least we know now," Mrs. Havisham announced firmly in the post office. "It's dreadful, of course, but better than all this guessing." Miss Marple, standing behind her, wondered quietly when certainty had become more comforting than truth. Colin Reed, though officially not charged, had become the subject of careful glances and lowered voices. People spoke kindly to his face and suspiciously behind his back, a village talent refined over generations. "He was under pressure," Mrs. Finch whispered. "Young men can do foolish things." "Yes," Miss Marple agreed mildly, "and so can older ones." Mrs. Finch looked startled, then smiled uncertainly, unsure whether she had been agreed with or corrected. Inspector Bell called that afternoon, his manner brisk. "We've had to restrict Colin's movements for the time being," he said. "Purely procedural." "Of course," Miss Marple replied. "Procedures are very reassuring." Inspector Bell hesitated. "You don't think we're mistaken?" Miss Marple poured tea. "I think," she said, "that people often behave most oddly when they believe they are nearly caught, even if they are not." Inspector Bell frowned. "And Colin?" "Oh, Colin is frightened," Miss Marple said. "But frightened people are not always guilty. Sometimes they are merely convenient." The Christmas fete, postponed briefly out of respect, was reinstated with renewed determination. Mrs. Havisham insisted that Leonard Pritchard would have wanted it so, though she now referred to him as "poor Leonard" with a faint note of reproach. Miss Marple attended as she always did, seated near the raffle table with her knitting. From there she had an excellent view of the room. Emily Pritchard arrived late, pale and withdrawn. She moved carefully, as though every step required consideration. Miss Marple noticed that she spoke very little, but listened intently. Colin Reed was absent. Mrs. Havisham filled the space with her voice. "It's such a shame," she said loudly, "when young people let ambition get the better of them." Miss Marple watched Emily's face tighten just briefly before smoothing itself again. It was during the singing of carols that the second disturbance occurred. A cry, not loud but sharp enough to cut through the music, came from the side corridor. The singing faltered, then stopped. Someone shouted for the doctor. Miss Marple rose slowly, already certain of what she would find. Colin Reed lay on a bench near the vestry, pale and shaking, clutching his chest. Beside him, a dropped cup lay shattered on the floor, its contents soaking into the stone. The doctor arrived quickly and pronounced that Colin had suffered a severe shock, but again not poisoning. Inspector Bell's face darkened. "Someone's trying to frighten him," he said sharply. "Yes," Miss Marple agreed, "or silence him." Emily Pritchard stood very still nearby, her hands clenched together. Later, as the hall emptied, Miss Marple approached Emily quietly. "You look quite unwell, my dear," she said kindly. Emily forced a smile. "It's all been very upsetting." "Yes," Miss Marple said, "especially when events refuse to behave as expected." Emily's eyes flickered. "I don't know what you mean." "No," Miss Marple said gently, "but someone does." That night, Miss Marple sat by her fire, reviewing the day with care. Someone had wanted Colin frightened, enough to prevent him speaking further, but not enough to cause permanent harm. The cup near him had contained only sweetened tea, no poison, a rehearsal perhaps, or a reminder. She thought of the ledger again, the torn page, removed with precision. Of Leonard Pritchard's habit of sugar only when distressed. Of Emily's careful silences. People who planned, Miss Marple reflected, often disliked improvisation, and someone in St. Mary Mead was being forced to improvise. The following morning brought a new development. Inspector Bell arrived with the ledger in hand. "We've identified one of the names on the missing page," he said. "A local supplier. He remembers making payments to Leonard Pritchard under pressure." "Pressure," Miss Marple echoed. "He says Pritchard threatened exposure," Inspector Bell continued. "Financial ruin." Miss Marple nodded. "Blackmail is a lonely occupation. One never knows when the tables might turn." Inspector Bell looked at her sharply. "You think Leonard Pritchard was in danger long before his death?" "I think," Miss Marple replied, "that when many people are frightened by one man, it only takes one frightened person to change matters entirely." That afternoon, Miss Marple paid a visit to Emily Pritchard's cottage. Emily admitted her without surprise. "I wondered when you would come," Emily said quietly. "Did you?" Miss Marple replied. "Why?" Emily hesitated. "Because you listen. Most people only decide." Miss Marple glanced around the room. Everything was tidy, almost excessively so. "Your uncle liked order," she said. "Yes," Emily replied. "He believed it kept chaos away." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "It rarely does." Emily looked at her then, really looked. "You think they're wrong about Colin?" she said. "I think," Miss Marple replied gently, "that St. Mary Mead has chosen its villain too quickly." Emily's breath caught, just for a moment. Outside, church bells rang in the cold air, practicing once more for Christmas Day. Miss Marple rose to leave. "Do try to rest," she said kindly. This sort of strain has a way of telling on people, especially when they are holding things in. As she walked home, Miss Marple felt certain of one thing. The village believed the mystery nearly solved, but the truth, she knew, was growing restless. And when it moved, it would do so suddenly, and not at all gently. Chapter 6. A Small Test of Truth. St. Mary Mead woke to a pale winter sun that revealed rather more than was comfortable. The snow had melted into thin, muddy lines along the paths, and the village looked tired, decorations drooping slightly, wreaths browning at the edges. Christmas was close enough to demand cheer, yet far enough away to allow unease. Miss Marple noticed, as she always did, that people greeted one another with exaggerated warmth. It was the sort of warmth that suggested everyone was trying very hard not to think about something. She finished her breakfast, folded her newspaper, and decided that the time had come to test a small idea. Not a dramatic test, those were best left to inspectors, but something gentle. Human nature, she knew, often revealed itself most clearly when nudged ever so slightly out of balance. Her first visit was to the post office. "I hear," she said conversationally to Mrs. Finch, "that Inspector Bell is making excellent progress. Such a relief before Christmas." Mrs. Finch brightened. "Oh yes, everyone says it's nearly settled now." "Indeed?" Miss Marple asked. "I understand they're close to proving how the poison was introduced." Mrs. Finch leaned closer. "Through the sugar bowl, wasn't it?" Miss Marple smiled. "Was it? Well, that's what people say." "People," Miss Marple agreed, "often do." She left the post office and walked on, satisfied. Rumour had fixed itself firmly. That, she knew, made it far more dangerous to those who depended upon it. Her next stop was Pritchard's Drapery. The shop was still closed, but Inspector Bell had allowed limited access while inventories were taken. Miss Marple arrived just as the constable on duty stepped outside to answer a call, leaving the door momentarily unattended. She did not enter fully. She had no wish to break rules, but she stood just inside the threshold and looked. Nothing had changed, yet everything felt different. She noticed the counter again, the place where Leonard Pritchard had arranged his spectacles so carefully. She noticed the chair, now upright, positioned precisely as before. And she noticed the sugar bowl still on the shelf behind the counter, its lid slightly chipped. Miss Marple leaned closer. The sugar inside was white, clean, and untouched. Too untouched. Leonard Pritchard, she knew, had been meticulous, but not wasteful. Sugar used only occasionally would show signs of use. This bowl did not. Interesting. That afternoon, she paid a call on Colonel and Mrs. Bantry. "I don't envy Inspector Bell," Colonel Bantry declared. "Village cases are always the worst. Everyone knows everyone else, and suspects them all." "Yes," Miss Marple said gently. "Familiarity can be very misleading." Mrs. Bantry frowned thoughtfully. "You know, Leonard once complained to me that someone had been using his things without asking. His cups, he said, his sugar." "Did he?" Miss Marple asked mildly. "Oh yes, he was quite put out." Miss Marple thanked them and took her leave, her mind neatly aligning itself. The real test came later that evening. Miss Marple invited Emily Pritchard to tea. Emily arrived promptly, dressed neatly, her manner controlled but strained. She looked, Miss Marple thought, like someone waiting for an examination she had studied for too long. They spoke first of trivial things, the weather, the fete, the difficulty of finding decent ribbon so close to Christmas. Then Miss Marple poured tea. "Oh dear," she said, peering into the sugar bowl. "I seem to have run out of lumps, only granulated left. Do you mind?" Emily stiffened almost imperceptibly. "Not at all," she said quickly. I don't take sugar." "Neither do I, usually," Miss Marple replied. "But it can be comforting, don't you think, when one is distressed?" Emily's hand trembled slightly as she lifted her cup. Miss Marple watched her closely. "You know," she went on lightly, "Leonard Pritchard only took sugar when he was under strain. Some people are very particular that way." Emily's cup paused halfway to her lips. "Yes," she said softly. "He told me that." Miss Marple smiled kindly. "Did he?" she asked. Emily nodded. He mentioned it often." Miss Marple stirred her tea. "Curious," she said, "because most people I've spoken to only noticed it recently." Emily's fingers tightened around the cup. Miss Marple changed the subject at once, speaking of Christmas cards and the difficulty of writing cheerful messages in difficult times. Emily responded politely, but something had shifted. Her composure was now held together by effort rather than habit. When she left, she forgot her gloves. Miss Marple returned them personally an hour later. As she walked home, Miss Marple reflected quietly. Emily Pritchard knew too much, and too precisely. She knew habits that Leonard Pritchard rarely discussed. She reacted not to accusations, but to implications, and someone, Miss Marple believed, had been using the shop after hours, using Leonard's things, his cups, his sugar, without his permission. Someone who knew exactly how much could be used without notice. Inspector Bell arrived the next morning, visibly preoccupied. "We've had a new statement," he said. "The supplier insists the missing ledger page concerned payments Leonard was making, not receiving." "Protection," Miss Marple suggested. Inspector Bell frowned. "Possibly. People who pay for protection," Miss Marple said gently, "are rarely the most powerful in the arrangement." Inspector Bell stared at her. "You think Leonard Pritchard was frightened?" "I think," Miss Marple replied, "that he was under pressure from more than one direction, and that one of those pressures lived very close to him." Inspector Bell was silent for a long moment. That evening, St. Mary Mead prepared once more for Christmas. Lights were relit. Carols rehearsed again. The village was determined to restore order. Miss Marple sat by her fire, knitting steadily. She was now quite certain of one thing. The poison had not been added impulsively. It had been added by someone who knew Leonard's habits intimately, someone who could predict distress, encourage it, and wait. And whoever that person was, they were beginning to realize that Miss Marple had stopped asking questions. She was listening now. And people, she knew, made their most dangerous mistakes when they believed the questions were over. Chapter 7. The Stillness Before the Bells. On the morning of Christmas Eve, St. Mary Mead wore an air of deliberate calm. Shops reopened with careful smiles. Parcels were exchanged. The church bell practiced its peal with renewed confidence, as though assured that whatever unpleasantness had threatened the season had now been politely dealt with. People spoke of mince pies and weather, and when Leonard Pritchard's name arose, as it still did, it was with the satisfied tone of those who believe a story has reached its proper conclusion. Miss Marple noticed, however, that the calm was brittle. It showed itself in the way Mrs. Havisham paused too long before answering simple questions. and in the way Emily Pritchard avoided the centre of any room, skirting the edges as though afraid of disturbing something. It showed itself too, in Inspector Bell's expression, determined, certainly, but uneasy. Miss Marple sat at her window, knitting steadily, and waited. Inspector Bell arrived just after luncheon. "We've made progress," he said, though his voice suggested that he wished he felt more certain of it. "Colin Reed has been formally cleared. The evidence simply doesn't support the charge." "That must be a relief," Miss Marple said. "For him, yes. For the case, less so." Miss Marple set her knitting aside. "Because when a village loses its chosen villain, it becomes most anxious to find another." Inspector Bell gave a reluctant smile. "You've noticed that, have you?" "I've lived here a long time," Miss Marple replied. "Villages are rather like families. They dislike unfinished stories." Inspector Bell hesitated. "There's something else. The chemist has confirmed that the poison used could be obtained quite legally in small quantities." "By someone with patience," Miss Marple said gently. "And knowledge," Inspector Bell added. "Knowledge is rarely as rare as we think," Miss Marple replied. "Opportunity, on the other hand." She let the sentence trail away. Inspector Bell stood. "I'm calling a meeting tonight, just informal. I'd like you to be there." Miss Marple inclined her head. Of course. The meeting took place in the sitting room of the vicarage, the fire lit, the air thick with forced civility. Mrs. Havisham sat upright, hands folded, her expression alert. Emily Pritchard took a chair slightly apart from the others, her posture composed but strained. Colonel and Mrs. Bantry were present, as were several villagers with plausible reasons to be included. Miss Marple sat quietly near the fire. Inspector Bell spoke first, outlining the facts as they were now understood. Leonard Pritchard had been poisoned over time. The poison had been introduced into something he consumed only under stress. The ledger suggested pressure, financial, personal, and persistent. "What we need," Inspector Bell concluded, "is clarity." Mrs. Havisham provided it at once. "I always said it was a family matter," she declared. "These things usually are." Emily Pritchard's head lifted sharply. Miss Marple watched her closely. Inspector Bell raised a hand. "Speculation won't help us now." "On the contrary," Miss Marple said gently, speaking for the first time. "Speculation tells us a great deal about the person doing the speculating." Mrs. Havisham flushed. Miss Marple continued calmly. "Leonard Pritchard frightened people. Some paid him, some resented him, but only one person benefited from his death without delay." Emily Pritchard's breath caught, just audibly. Miss Marple did not look at her. "And only one person," she went on, "had the habit of watching him closely enough to know exactly when he would reach for sugar." A silence settled over the room. Inspector Bell shifted. "Miss Marple?" "Not yet," Miss Marple said softly. She rose and crossed to the side table where tea had been laid out. She lifted the sugar bowl, examining it briefly. "Do you know," she said lightly, "that Leonard Pritchard's sugar bowl in the shop was almost never used? Yet his personal cups were washed frequently." Emily Pritchard's hands clenched in her lap. "Someone," Miss Marple continued, "was using those cups after hours. Someone careful, someone who knew which habits mattered and which could be imitated." Mrs. Bantry inhaled sharply. Inspector Bell said nothing. After the meeting broke up, Miss Marple found Emily waiting for her in the cold night air. "You think it was me?" Emily said quietly. "I think," Miss Marple replied, "that you have been under extraordinary strain for a very long time." Emily laughed, a short, brittle sound. "You make it sound so reasonable." "Pressure often feels that way to the person bearing it," Miss Marple said, especially when it has become familiar. Emily looked at the darkened village. My uncle was not kind, she said. He believed fear was efficient. Yes, Miss Marple said, many people do. They stood in silence for a moment. Christmas is tomorrow, Emily said suddenly. Will this be finished by then? Miss Marple met her gaze. Truth does not observe holidays. Emily nodded once, sharply, and walked away. That night, Miss Marple slept lightly. In the early hours, she rose, wrapped herself in her shawl, and stood by the window. Snow had begun to fall again, soft, steady, and deceptively peaceful. She thought of Leonard Pritchard's neat habits, of sugar taken only in distress, of pressure applied carefully over time, and of a young woman who had learned too well how to wait. By morning, Miss Marple knew the bells would ring, and before 12th night the village would hear the truth, whether it wished to or not. She returned to her bed, her mind calm at last. The last piece, she felt certain, was about to fall into place. Chapter 8. Miss Marple Remembers. Christmas morning dawned clear and cold, the sort of morning that encouraged forgiveness and discouraged reflection. St. Mary Mead rang its bells with confidence, and for a brief while the village allowed itself to believe that unpleasantness belonged firmly to the past. Miss Marple did not share that belief. She attended church as usual, her grey shawl neatly folded, her expression mild. She sang the hymns softly and watched the congregation with affectionate attention. People looked relieved, almost festive. It was extraordinary, she thought, how quickly relief could replace concern once certainty seemed close at hand. After the service, Inspector Bell asked her quietly if she would join him at the vicarage. There were a few others present: Colonel and Mrs. Bantry, Mrs. Havisham, Emily Pritchard, and Colin Reed, who looked thinner and far more cautious than before. Tea was served, the fire crackled, everything looked comfortable, which Miss Marple knew was often when truth felt most uncomfortable. Inspector Bell cleared his throat. Miss Marple, he said, you indicated that you believed the time had come. Yes, she replied gently. I think it has. She folded her hands in her lap. Leonard Pritchard, she began, was a man who believed in order, in neatness, in control. He frightened people because fear, to him, was efficient. I've known men like him before. One ran a boarding house in Bournemouth and another managed a charity committee. Very different circumstances, but exactly the same habits. She looked around the room. He kept records, he applied pressure carefully, and he trusted routine more than people. Mrs. Havisham nodded vigorously. Yes, quite. Miss Marple held up a hand. Please let me finish. She turned slightly toward Colin Reed. You were suspected because you were frightened, but frightened people behave openly. They collapse, they panic, they tell the wrong people the wrong things at the wrong time. Colin swallowed and nodded. You found the ledger, Miss Marple continued, but you did not understand it fully. That is why you were never dangerous. She then looked at Emily Pritchard. Emily, she said kindly, you understood it all. Emily's face was pale, but she did not look away. You grew up watching your uncle. You knew when he was calm and you knew when he was distressed. You knew he only took sugar when upset, and you knew how to upset him. A murmur ran through the room. Miss Marple continued calmly. You did not poison him in a single act. That would have been risky. Instead, you waited. You encouraged his anxieties quietly, patiently. You ensured the sugar he used during those moments was altered in quantities so small they would never be noticed at once. Inspector Bell leaned forward. The ledger, Miss Marple went on, was not removed to hide the crime, but to control the timing of its discovery. You wanted the village to look outward first, at debts, At blackmail. At Colin. Emily closed her eyes. You used Leonard's own habits against him, Miss Marple said, and you arranged the scene carefully because chaos would have suggested panic. You were not panicking. Emily's voice, when she spoke, was very soft. He ruined people, she said. Quietly, respectably, he ruined me. Miss Marple nodded. Yes. And you waited until Christmas because you knew the village would prefer a neat answer before the holiday. You relied on their impatience. Inspector Bell stood slowly. Emily Pritchard, he said, I must ask. Emily raised her hand. No, she said, there's no need. She looked at Miss Marple. You knew when I reacted to the sugar, she said. Yes, Miss Marple replied. Because innocent people react to accusation, guilty people react to implication. Emily let out a long breath. I didn't want to kill him, she said. I wanted it to stop. Miss Marple's voice was gentle. It always begins that way. Inspector Bell moved closer, his tone professional, but not unkind. You'll need to come with me, Miss Pritchard. Emily nodded. She looked oddly relieved. As she was led away, Mrs. Havisham dabbed at her eyes. How dreadful, she said. And just before Christmas? Miss Marple looked at her. Yes, she said quietly. That is often when the truth insists on being heard. That evening, St. Mary Mead gathered again, this time with genuine calm. Carols sounded less forced, lights seemed warmer. Miss Marple sat at home, knitting steadily. Inspector Bell called later to thank her. You solved it by watching people, he said. People are always the answer, Miss Marple replied. Poison is merely the method. She hung up and returned to her knitting. Outside, snow fell softly, covering the village once more. Not to hide what had happened, but to remind it that life went on. Miss Marple finished her scarf at last, folded it neatly, and placed it by the fire. Christmas, she reflected, was a season of endings as much as beginnings. And St. Mary Mead, for all its quiet lanes and gentle manners, would never truly change. Nor, she suspected, would human nature. She smiled faintly and reached for the teapot.